UFO situation with the press. Donald Keyhoe reports on the press conference and the events leading up to it in detail in his book, Flying Saucers from Outer Space. He indicates that before the conference started, General Samford sat behind his big walnut desk in room 3A-138 in the Pentagon and battled with his conscience. Should he tell the public the real truth, that our skies are loaded with spaceships? No, the public might panic. The only answer would be to debunk the UFOs. This bit of reporting makes Major Keyhoe the greatest journalist in history. This beats wiretapping. He reads minds. And not only that, he can read them right through the walls of the Pentagon. But I'm glad that Keyhoe was able to read the general's mind, and that he wrote the true and accurate facts about what he was really thinking, because I spent quite a bit of time talking to the general that day, and he sure fooled me. I had no idea he was. When the press conference, which was the largest and longest the Air Force had held since World War II, convened at 4:00 p.m., General Samford made an honest effort to straighten out the Washington National sightings, but the cards were stacked against him before he started. He had to hedge on many answers to questions from the press because he didn't know the answers. This hedging gave the impression that he was trying to cover up something more than just the fact that his people had fouled up in not fully investigating the sightings. Then he had brought in Captain Roy James from ATIC to handle all the queries about radar. James didn't do any better because he'd just arrived in Washington that morning and didn't know very much more about the sightings than he'd read in the papers. Major Dewey Fournay and Lieutenant Holcomb, who had been at the airport during the sightings, were extremely conspicuous by their absence, especially since it was common knowledge among the press that they weren't convinced the UFOs picked up on radars were weather targets. But somehow, out of this chaotic situation came exactly the result that was intended. The press got off our backs. Captain James's answers about the possibility of the radar targets being caused by temperature inversions had been construed by the press to mean that this was the Air Force's answer, even though today the twin sightings are still carried as unknowns. The next morning, headlines from Bangor to Bogota read, "Air Force debunks saucers as just natural phenomena." The Washington National sightings proved one thing, something that many of us already knew. In order to forestall any more trouble similar to what we'd just been through, we always had to get all of the facts and not try to hide them. A great deal of the press's interest was caused by the Air Force's reluctance to give out any information, and the reluctance on the part of the Air Force was caused by simply not having gone out to find the answers. But had someone gone out and made a more thorough investigation, a few big questions would have popped up and taken some of the intrigue out of the two reports. It took me a year to put the question marks together because I just picked up the information as I happened to run across it. But it could have been collected in a day of concentrated effort. There was some doubt about the visual sighting of the large, fiery orange-colored sphere that the tower operators at Andrews Air Force Base saw when the radar operators at National Airport told them they had a target over the Andrews radio range station. When the tower operators were later interrogated, they completely changed their story and said that what they saw was merely a star. They said that on the night of the sighting they had been excited. According to astronomical charts, there were no exceptionally bright stars where the UFO was seen over the range station, however. And I heard from a good source that the tower men had been persuaded a bit. Then the pilot of the F-94C changed his mind, even after he'd given the press and later told me his story about vainly trying to intercept unidentified lights. In an official report, he says that all he saw was a ground light reflecting off a layer of haze. Another question mark arose about the lights that the airline pilot saw. Months after the sighting, I heard from one of the pilots whom the ARTC controllers called to learn if he could see a UFO. This man's background was also impressive. He had been flying in and out of Washington since 1936. This is what he had to say. The most outstanding incident happened just after a takeoff one night from Washington National. The tower man advised us that there was a UFO ahead of us on the takeoff path and asked if we would aid in tracking it down. We were giving headings to follow, and shortly we were advised that we had passed the UFO and would be given a new heading. None of us in the cockpit had seen anything unusual. Several runs were made. Each time the tower man advised us we were passing the UFO, we noticed that we were over one certain section of the Potomac River, just east of Alexandria. Finally, we were asked to visually check the terrain below for anything which might cause such an illusion. We looked, and the only object we could see where the radar had a target turned out to be the Wilson Line's Moonlight steamboat trip to Mount Vernon. Whether there was an altitude gimmick on the radar unit at the time, I do not know, but the radar was sure as hell picking up the steamboat. The pilot went on to say that there is such a conglomeration of lights around the Washington area that no matter where you look, you see a mysterious light. Then there was another point. Although the radars at Washington National and Andrews overlap, and many of the targets appeared in the overlap area, only once did the three radars simultaneously pick up a target. The investigation brought out a few more points on the pro side, too. We found out that the UFOs frequently visited Washington. On May 23rd, 50 targets had been tracked from 8 o'clock p.m. till midnight. They were back on the Wednesday night between the two famous Saturday night sightings, the following Sunday night, and again the night of the press conference. Then during August, they were seen 8 more times. On several occasions, military and civilian pilots saw lights exactly where. On each night that there was a sighting, there was a temperature inversion, but it was never strong enough to affect the radar the way inversions normally do. On each occasion, I checked the strength of the inversion according to the methods used by the Air Defense Command Weather Forecast Center. Then there was another interesting fact. Hardly a night passed in June, July, and August in 1952 that there wasn't an inversion in Washington, yet the slow-moving, solid radar targets appeared on only a few nights. But the one big factor on the pro side of the question is the people involved. Good radar men who deal in human lives. Each day they use their radar to bring thousands of people into Washington National Airport, and with a responsibility like this, they should know a real target from a weather target. So, the Washington National Airport sightings are still unknowns. Had the press been aware of some of the other UFO activity in the United States during this period, the Washington sightings might not have been the center of interest. True, they could be classed as good reports, but they were not the best that we were getting. In fact, less than 6 hours after the ladies and gentlemen of the press said thank you to General Samford for his press conference, and before the UFOs could read the newspapers and find out that they were natural phenomena, One of them came down across the Canadian border into Michigan. The incident that occurred that night was one of those that even the most ardent skeptic would have difficulty explaining. I've heard a lot of them try, and I've heard them all fail. At 9:40 on the evening of the 29th, an Air Defense Command radar station in central Michigan started to get plots on a target that was coming straight south across Saginaw Bay on Lake Huron at 625 miles an hour. A quick check of flight plans on file showed that it was an unidentified target. 3 F-94s were in the area just northeast of the radar station, so the ground controller called one of the F-94s and told the pilot to intercept the unidentified target. The F-94 pilot started climbing out of the practice area on an intercept heading that the ground controller gave him. When the F-94 was at 20,000 feet, the ground controller told the pilot to turn to the right and he would be on the target. The pilot started to bring the F-94 around, and at that instant, both he and the radar operator in the back seat saw that they were turning toward a large bluish-white light, many times larger than a star. In the next second or two, the light took on a reddish tint and slowly began to get smaller, as if it were moving away. Just then, the ground controller called and said that he still had both the F-94 and the unidentified target on his scope, and that the target had just made a tight 180-degree turn. The turn was too tight for a jet, and at the speed the target was traveling, it would have to be a jet if it were an airplane. Now the target was heading back north. The F-94 pilot gave the engine full power and cut in the afterburner to give chase. The radar operator in the back seat got a good radar lock on. Later, he said, "It was just as solid a lock on as you can get from a B-36. The object was at 4 miles range, and the F-94 was closing slowly. For 30 seconds, they held the lock on. Then, just as the ground controller was telling the pilot that he was closing in, the light became brighter and the object pulled away to break the lock on. Without breaking his transmission, the ground controller asked if the radar operator still had the lock on, because on the scope, the distance between the two blips had almost doubled in one sweep of the antenna. This indicated that the unknown target had almost doubled its speed in a matter of seconds. For 10 minutes, the ground radar followed the chase. At times, the unidentified target would slow down and the F-94 would start to close the gap. But always, just as the F-94 was getting within radar range, the target would put on a sudden burst of speed and pull away from the pursuing jet. The speed of the UFO, for by this time all concerned had decided that was what it was, couldn't be measured too accurately because its bursts of speed were of such short duration. But on several occasions, the UFO traveled about 4 miles in one 10-second sweep of the antenna, or about 1,400 miles an hour.